Hello and welcome everyone here on site and of course also the folks online. I want to welcome you to this session of Ahead of the Curve with Value Chain Engagement. My name is Alexander Schmidt. I head Normative's Science, Sustainability and Climate Research Department. And I'm going to kick us off real quick before handing over to the moderator in a brilliant session in the following. But just to kick us off, I would like to set a bit the scene for this topic about ahead of the curve and what value chain engagement actually does here. So we actually teamed up with researchers, as we often do, and this data is in collaboration with the Net Zero Tracker, a project supported also by, among others, Oxford Net Zero. And we looked at actually companies who should be ahead of the curve. And those are companies who are committed to reducing their emissions to net zero. So we found that roughly 970 companies with existing net zero commitments, they would account for approximately 78% of industry emissions around the world. So this means, again, ahead of the curve, those are leaders who have committed to net zero, large publicly traded companies, and they would actually, if they were all to reach net zero, bring us almost 80% of the way, which is of course very encouraging news, right? This is really, really promising here. These are, again, companies who are ahead of the curve. But what happens now if you look behind those commitments, and what happens if you cannot see actually the impact and maybe you can't even see what you have committed to? What happens then? Well, the problem is this creates a huge gap, a business execution gap, right? So we have the willingness, we have the commitments, but now if those leading companies can't even see what they have officially committed to reduce, how could we actually get there? So we dug a bit further and deeper into this topic, and what we found is, once more, encouraging news. Those leading organizations, they start to make progress. I want to emphasize this because we often hear doom and gloom about nothing is moving at all. It's not as dire as it sometimes sounds. So we're making progress. Actually, in Scope 2 emissions, leaders in those industries were able to reduce emissions by over 7% in the last year. We need annual reduction of over 7.6% per year to keep net zero in sight. So they are quite close in Scope 2. So those are emissions that they have a reasonable amount of control over. Now we move to Scope 3. Again, encouragingly, they make progress. However, at a much too slow rate. And once more, those are leading companies, right? Those are ahead of the curve. Those are already companies who have realized and committed to reducing net zero across their entire emissions. I want to emphasize this point by another survey that we just released, where we surveyed 200 leaders in Europe and the UK, so EU and the UK, for how they do carbon accounting. And fewer than 30% are actually accounting for their Scope 3 emissions. So fewer than 30% account for Scope 3, and if they do account for it, they usually don't achieve the level of reduction that we need to achieve. So this, of course, is a problem. So how can we solve it? Well, first of all, we need to make sure that it's not just these leading companies who can see the carbon, but all companies have access to that data, have access to the full value chain emissions. They can actually calculate the full value chain emissions, because only then can you start to reduce and lead the way to net zero. So we need to empower companies to make these sizable impacts, timely impacts, and of course throughout their entire value chains. And that's what we're here to discuss with the panel, how to stay ahead of the curve with value chain engagement, to bring up both these figures around companies who are accounting for their emissions in Scope 3 and companies who are making actual sizable impact in reductions in Scope 3. So with this intro, I'm going to hand over to our panel and Robert. And this is going to be a process we're going to go to, I'm pretty sure, in the panel about how we can actually reduce and lead to net zero from capturing data, managing, disclosing, engaging, and of course plan and act. So I expect more of this to be part of our panel conversation. So thanks so much, and I'm handing over to you now.
Thank you very much, Alexander. You've run off the stage. I'd like you to come back up again, if you could. So let me introduce you to this fantastic panel that will really dig into these questions around how to make the invisible visible and why we need to do it. First of all, I welcome back onto stage Alexander Schmidt, who is the Head of Science, Sustainability and Climate Research at Normative. Alexander, thank you for your presentation. I think it's set us up really well for this conversation. Then let me invite Jonas Otterheim, who is Head of Climate Action at Volvo Cars. Very warm welcome to you, Jonas. And lastly, Maria Simonsson, who is Head of Sustainability at SEK. Very warm welcome to you all. Thank you. Thank you. So let me just start off with some perhaps more basic questions. I'd like to turn to you, if I can, Jonas, and just ask you, what are the challenges that you face in Volvo Cars from trying to capture and understand, making visible these Scope 3 emissions?
Well, as a car maker, if you look at our total emissions, we have a major challenge of understanding, well, initially the size of them, because we're very dependent on generic data. We, of course, are asking and want to capture supplier-specific data, but in the end of the day, our suppliers don't actually have that in place. So in many cases, we are reliant on, well, having to do these calculations ourselves, because regardless if we ask or not, they cannot provide it to us. And then secondly, we need to ensure that that data we do get, which is usually generic then, is accurate and specific enough so we can act in line with what we need to do. So those are sort of two generic challenges that I suppose many companies recognize themselves in, which we are at and we're trying to solve.
Can I just ask, in terms of your suppliers and why they're faced with a situation where they can't give you the data, is that because they don't know how to make the measurements, or is it more that you're asking them for something to deliver something that's quite far out in the future and they actually simply can't know exactly the sort of carbon content of the products they're going to be delivering?
Probably it's a bit of both, but I think the key thing why they are struggling is that these are suppliers that have a supply chain that is very, very long. And we are not only asking for their activity data, we're asking for their full supply chains data, because what we do is we want to have our complete Scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, which therefore include their full Scope 1, 2, 3 upstream. Meaning that they need to understand their full supply chain, which they don't necessarily do. And if they start asking, well, their supplier need to also be able to track, report, and complete this value chain. And that is simply not done in, well, all parts of the world. Some do, of course, but definitely not all.
Great. I want to throw the questions over to Alexander now. I mean, how does Normative help to try and help a company like Volvo drill down into the suppliers and their suppliers, et cetera, to give at least a better picture of what those emissions are, the Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, I was heavily nodding and kind of like supporting your view, because we hear this over and over again that companies are struggling to go exactly that extra mile, not just looking at your own Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions I was referring to before, but actually Scope 3. So this is why we have launched the Carbon Network, because that's what you need. That's exactly what you described, right? You need to connect these data points, you need to enable those smaller companies to go also there beyond kind of their own scope of emissions, or like their own Scope 1 and Scope 2 of emissions, and giving them the tools and empowering them. Oftentimes you have these large tails of suppliers, you have small, medium enterprises. We've been co-founder of the UN SME Climate Hub, where we empower those companies, because as you said, they often don't have the tools. They don't have the means to actually do the calculations, and they don't drop from heaven. And if you're relying on proxy data, which we often are right now, like spend data, you only have so many levers you can pull as a large organization. You can spend less, or you can spend a different category, but that's all you can do. So getting to primary data is so important. That's why we have this Carbon Network that connects buyers with suppliers, exchanges the data, and makes it transparent what actually is inherent in those products and in those supply chains.
Great. Let me move over to you, Maria, if I can. What's the role of carbon data for financiers in that case?
So the role of carbon data will be approximately same as financial data going forward. It's currently at a more immature stage right now. We don't really speak carbon. We haven't developed a collective understanding yet on exactly what to measure. And I think, but what it will do is that we're integrating climate considerations in all our financial decisions, basically. So carbon data will be one aspect when we do risk assessments. It will be an aspect when we identify opportunities in order to steer capital to more low carbon activities. So basically doing exactly what Volvo is doing here with understanding how their products and their activities, what kind of carbon footprint they have, will be an important element for us when we make a decision. So it will be absolutely pivotal. It has a few years to mature because we're at the stage where we need to assess our portfolio companies, the assets we hold, which is basically the whole business community. How should we understand what we're financing there? So we're also building a language of understanding methodologies, understanding data quality, how to do this fragmented picture, how to make that more standardized. But we're working on it, I think, quite fast. And it's, of course, encouraging to see both the tools for maybe smaller companies, mid-sized companies that doesn't have all the resources that the larger ones have, but also seeing the larger companies moving ahead and showing that it is possible. So I think it's positive for us in finance.
Jonas, please. You want to...
Yeah, I'm jumping in because I very much support what you do. What we are doing is that we see that the financial sector is putting really tough requirements on us, because they see this makes business sense. So from our perspective, since we are more or less in a situation where our supply chain is not really delivering what we need, is that we see we need data, but it's not only that we need data from a corporate level. We need data at the right point of time in the right part of the organization for that individual or for that business decision to include CO2 or sustainability. So we're building the capability to see the data, but at the right point in time in the decision making. And for a car company, that is actually, or probably rather different to many other companies, but our development cycle is rather long. So right now, our company is thinking of cars to be launched in 2028, 2029, etc. And due to that problem, unless we give that individual insight into the effect of that decision, they will take a decision today that will limit our ability to launch a car in 28, 29, or to be low enough or to be in line with our targets. Last week, we launched new 2030 targets saying that we are to reduce CO2 emissions by 75% versus 2018 on a per car level. And we know already today that we will fail on this target unless we act very differently to what we have done before. And definitely we will fail unless these decisions also include CO2. So we're building this capability to inform at the right level, at the right point in time, so they act. And then we need all this type of data, but at different levels of point in time, definitely on a corporate sort of summarized level and from a sourcing decision, but also in a sort of design stage where we more or less just need to have an 80-20 rule. Is this indicatively right? Yep.
That's great.
And if I just may say, because then there's a lot of talk about we need finance, and those kind of data quality aspects, a company saying we have roughly what we think we know for 2028 is sufficient at this point. So I really want to encourage that just doing that kind of work, analyzing it, putting it into the investment decision is what we want to see at this point in time. We know that data will improve. We know that quality will improve, but understanding the capabilities of a strategic decision, how does that take into account climate considerations, is super crucial at this point in time.
So really interesting to hear a perspective to say that, you know, this is going to be as important as the financial data in helping to make decisions, but also at the level of companies, you know, it's really important in product development, in procurement and things like that. So those are two reasons, if you like, to begin this journey to try and get ahead of the curve. Can I ask, are there any other reasons, are there any other incentives, or maybe they're sticks rather than carrots, that are forcing people to really take it more seriously? Perhaps, Jonas.
I usually sort of say that as a car maker, car makers are not usually seen as the most sustainable companies in the world. And that is, of course, a challenge for us because we want to do good and we are trying to do this in the right way, but we more or less realize we need to overproof any claim we are to do, because otherwise someone will call us out of not doing what we claim to do. It might be that sort of call out is not really grounded, but in the end of the day, we can't risk of being accused of greenwashing. So due to that fact, we are dependent on high quality data. And in many cases of our value chain, well, we know that they can't do it. And that means either we make them change, or we're unable to talk about good stuff we're doing and that our value chain is doing, because the data quality might not be good enough. So in the end of the day, we might do all these good activities, but we will never dare to talk about them publicly, even though they actually happened, because the data quality might not be good enough in the end. And that's an interesting challenge we have.
So Maria, how do you deal with this issue of credibility and quality?
How we deal with it, I think number one is to be aware of it. Number two is to be pretty accurate in your disclosures, to be really transparent that this is what we know at this point in time, and there are several measures you can take to sort of grade your data, and we say it's a number 1 on a scale to 5, for instance. That could be one thing, to just educate your stakeholders on what you're trying to achieve. I think that gets you a long way. I think the key for accounting for emissions is accountability, which is basically what's coming after you have disclosed something, which means that you have to be also prepared to be accountable for it. And that, I think, could be a cultural thing in the company. You have to make sure that you also then have a strategy leaning forward and making sure that you also deal with it. So you have to have some sort of capabilities, again, in the company to actually take action on those carbon accounts that you have. But there's going to be a journey with double accounting and data proving to be not what we thought it was be. But I think if we don't move forward against those insecurities, we're not going to get ahead. So I think it's that kind of mindset that you need to 80-20 rule, perhaps.
Alexander, perhaps you want to come in and talk a little bit about the credibility, the scientific rigor that you're trying to bring into this accounting.
Yeah, no, I would love to. And I think we touched upon many key words there that I was kind of like, again, smiling and nodding along. You just said accountability. Funnily enough, we just brought out a report that we call the Carbon Accountability Report, where we surveyed those 200 business leaders I was referring to earlier and seeing where they are at right now. And it all comes down to transparency. Transparency as to they all showed, more than 90% showed they have recognized the value. They incorporate this in business decisions already now. They know they need to have the standards, the protocols in place. And yet we see this gap still. And that's something that's so concerning when you see there is just always still this execution gap. So to your question, how do we try to empower them? Well, I think on 2 fronts. One I already was alluding to as to our software solution, how we help them to accurately account for, connect them to other accounts, and not just getting single data points. You mentioned before, it's important to have foresight, right? What comes next for them? So beyond just looking at the carbon data right now, you can also then see in this platform where do they stand in terms of strategy and targets? Because maybe you have a large contributor to your value chain emissions, but they are on track. They have everything figured out in terms of a net zero pledge is in place, they have a strategy, and then there might be a mid-sized polluter in your value chain. They have nothing yet. So focusing on them now, because in 5 years, that's going to otherwise come back to you. In terms of regulations, you have to account for those folks. And secondly, and then I'm happy to hand over to you, on the policy space. So we are also very active working with regulators to help them make sense of what's happening on the ground, to kind of be that connective tissue between businesses and then the policy, but also helping them to shape the standards. What we hear over and over again is it's right now a mess, to be honest, out there. We are in a multinational company. We have all these jurisdictions, and they require different reporting standards, depth of disclosures. So there will be some cleanup that we can expect coming forward, but we're working actively with organizations like Oxford together to look at how the policy space can further converge to standards that help organizations to be more proactive and to reap the benefits of being proactive.
Brilliant. Let's hand straight over to Jonas. He might have something to say about convergence and the advantages of having that, but there's something else perhaps you want to start with.
exactly. I'm just nodding because I think this is an interesting discussion. My main point here was you talked about visibility of other strategies. I talked about our 2030 target. Right now, we announced it last week, so this is rather recent announcement from us. But in usual terms, companies don't talk about their future strategies that much. They might talk about it in vague terms, but in our case, we seldom talk about the future car unless it launched. We talk with our suppliers when we want to buy from them. But what we see already is that we need to work differently. We need to collaborate very differently with our full value chain, because otherwise they will never have time to deliver what we want from them in time when the sourcing question actually comes. So the visibility of the strategy, I think that is critical. Companies must work differently and must collaborate much more, because otherwise either we will fail or we will sort of double work and everyone is being cautious because the others might not actually deliver, or that they don't know about the fantastic plans. So in the end of the day, we will just sort of overshoot and be inefficient in resources. But if we actually collaborate here, we can actually be more concrete and specific and have a better chance of reaching the targets.
Have you got any good examples of that type of collaboration?
Well, we have communicated from last week that we are joining something called First Movers Coalition. What that means is that we are putting our purchasing power behind that we want to source so-called near zero aluminum by 2030. This is from technologies that don't yet actually exist in scale. But what they're saying is that we are willing to pay. We're setting that 10% of our primary aluminum by 2030 will be such near zero aluminum. And due to that fact, there will be money available here for the suppliers that can come. Of course, we're a global company, so we need global supply. There might be a few companies in some countries that have it, but in the end of the day, we need it across the world. And that is a very concrete example. So please come deliver or supply us with such materials. That's aluminum. We do the same for steel, etc. But in the end of the day, if we don't have it, I can already today say that we will fail on our targets. And of course, we won't accept that. So we need this.
Great. Maria?
I think that's brilliant, because you see that in other industries as well. Shipping, for instance, they've gone forward and said, we're going to build a ship that's going to run on fuel that doesn't really exist yet. So there are those kind of examples where I think, so we all put down, how many companies was it? Like 2045, 2050 targets, net zero targets. That is an indication of strategy. So that means that you're going to do something else tomorrow, that you're going to be future-proof tomorrow. And I think that kind of forward-looking strategy is exactly where we want collaboration and engagement on, because you don't understand exactly what you need to do. I might have a view that if you do that, you can access those kind of funds. And those kind of talks, there is transition funds available for those that want to transition. And for that, we need carbon data to show where you're going to transition from. So that could be an entry into those kind of financing.
So actually, there are developments in, if you like, carbon or climate financing, such as transition finance, that will depend partly on having strategies and having the sort of data in order to be activated.
We talk about a baseline sometimes.
Yeah.
Like, where's your starting point? Yeah. And that's irrelevant if you don't know where you're going. So if you have a starting point, now we know where we're going, but we don't have the starting point yet. We're trying to get it, everyone. And when we have that, it will be much more simple. It won't be simple, but to say, okay, I'm going to go there. I have those kind of investments in place. I have this kind of capability in place. Take a bet on me. Give me the money. And that would be a loan application, actually.
And let me just go a little bit further, because I know you have a background in not only in SEK, but also in banking. Do you think that a bank might look more favorably on a loan application that comes from a company that understands its baseline and has an ambition to address scope 1, 2, and 3?
I can't talk for all banks, but I know all banks are looking into their financed emissions. So you're looking into what are we financing? What's the attribution of our money to their carbon emissions? So that's an important data point for banks going forward. Whether or not it will be looking more favorable to it, that could be in the sense of good governance. You should be governing your risks and opportunities as a company. There are transition funds available that could perhaps take it in. But I think from a risk perspective, that's good governance of a company to know your potential liabilities, risks, and opportunities going forward.
Alexander, please.
Just jumping in there, because we have a good example actually of how this looks like in action. So we work together with Nordea, one of the big Nordic banks, and exactly on that topic, pretty much the blueprint you were just sketching out. So we help their business clients, business banking clients, to actually submit their data through a free tool that we developed together with Google.org. It's also on the Climate Hub. So that's, again, this ecosystem where we enable smaller companies to to provide the data to larger entities, and then those entities can actually make decisions, place new innovative products around this. So again, service offerings, speaking about incentives and what is in it for them beyond being compliant. But this proactive attitude that we enable, in this case, Nordea, to take on. This is really something that we, in a recent white paper we brought out with CDP and with Bankers for Net Zero, we really paint this picture of be proactive. Don't wait don't always try to clear the bar, but jump higher and actually say, hey, what's in it for me if I go actually beyond that? I'm not only prepared for regulations that are to become, and for sure they will come, for all of us, in terms of disclosure of value chain emissions, finance emissions, etc. So look beyond that, be proactive, enable suppliers, and reap the benefits of being ahead of the curve, as is the topic of this panel.
So, yes.
I was just getting very enthusiastic here, because a lot of this will have to do with standardization. And just a wild idea, what if we could, by providing these kind of platforms, because the SMEs won't have the resources to develop it themselves, they could provide a bottom-up standard that the larger companies would then take in. Because there are these kind of initiatives, not only from Normative, but other companies that provide the same thing around the globe. I saw something developing here in UAE, for instance. If that is speaking the same language, then in not too long, perhaps we could have a standard approach towards SMEs, at least, that has the least resources, that risk falling behind, and that could be actually a trigger to put into the other value chains.
Couldn't agree more. That's also, again, why with the SME Climate Hub, with CDP, Normative has developed this standard for disclosure for SMEs. So we need to get to a common language. We can't, keep asking SMEs to report on 5 different standards. Again, SMEs sometimes are like 5 people, and they have the focus on their own business, and they should do so because that's what they are best at doing. They can't have a head of sustainability who goes around full-time doing these things. So again, data exchange, right? Another good example is in UK, the Perseus project. Actually, this evening we have one launch event at the UK pavilion. Normative is tech co-founder of this whole initiative. Again, this is bringing together the right data to the right people in a standardized format. And we need more of that, 100%. So yeah, let's all get together and work on this. This is the message.
We talked about sort of legislation and the cost of inaction if we actually don't do this and get these data quality in place. Of course, many of us companies willing to invest in this, we see the cost of action as well. Sort of, we need to take some steps because this must happen to also avoid the cost of inaction. But building on the data quality here, what I also see is that we need better data quality and, well, the full value chain, because otherwise we might be inefficient in what actions we take. Because, of course, we cannot act on everything at once. We see all the steps or high level the steps we need to take by 2030, but not all of them are cost efficient today. A few of them might actually be waste of money today. So we should use the same money, but spend it somewhere else in the value chain and do more there. But take that step in a few years from now or ensure that the scale is coming up in another way. So I think there's an interesting balance here, what we do at what point in time, and we are dependent on data quality to actually not overspend money in some area versus another.
Can I ask a little bit more, perhaps from the Volvo experience, about how you make sure that the people who can act on the data actually are able to use it, that they have the right, knowledge, skills in order to be able to do so?
Now, of course, that's a very big change management work that's happening internally. So we need to train, the individuals in what they are getting and what insights they should draw from that specific data. Of course, they should not be sustainability experts all across, but they need to, start to talk carbon, as you talked about. But I think there is also an interesting aspect of getting the feel for what is CO2 equivalence and what does it actually mean. In our sourcing decisions, I think there is a very important capability to be able to look at the data that the supplier might provide to you and be able to, realize, is this actually reasonable or not? And sort of with the proofs that the supplier might provide us, are they actually able to deliver according to the CO2 result that they are claiming? And if not, call them out. Because I think this discussion is what also helping the suppliers become better. Sort of, please prove that you have certificates on that specific part of the value chain, because it doesn't make sense to us. Our calculations show something else. So start the discussion there. We're doing it with cost, of course. It's exactly the same discussion, but that needs to happen in CO2.
And you're pretty confident that this sort of work can be done without some sort of independent verification, someone coming and giving it the certificate of accuracy?
Absolutely not. We internally, for decision making, we can likely build this capability and come very far without external independent verification. But in the end of the day, of course, we want the suppliers to prove what they have. So in one way or another, they need to have certificates of what they do. And if we are to also talk about it externally, which we of course hope to do, then we are very dependent on it. So either full life cycle assessments, EPDs, certificates, we more or less need it all to be able to claim anything based on what they have.
Right. I've heard that Heidelberg Materials have actually introduced that all the bonuses for their managers are linked to meeting their climate targets. How about that?
We have the same.
You have the same. Right. Excellent. Let me come to you, back to you, Maria, if I can. The companies are in the SEK portfolio. When you are talking to them about their carbon data and trying to get hold of it, what are the main challenges they come to you and say, oh, well, it's difficult because we don't have the resources, we don't have the knowledge? What are the main issues?
I think at this point in time, we're in the finance industry 1 year after the corporates who are supposed to disclose and report this. So one capability we're building right now is to understand where can we get this data from. So we're also been in the process of looking into data suppliers because a lot of our customers and counterparties do not have this kind of data at all. And the reporting requirements is coming in quite soon for us. So we're building an internal infrastructure, you could say, the same way as Volvo has been doing with our needs, which is to get a supplier in that can provide us with data. We finance Swedish exporters, their suppliers, but also their buyers. And those projects out in developing countries where we might have a counterparty, which is a Ministry of Transportation, they will not be able to provide us with data anytime soon. So we need to work with approximations, assessments of how could this be sort of ring-fenced to our project and what we're financing. A lot of work going into that. And then, of course, building up our internal infrastructure with the IT system to provide us with attaching that carbon data with financial data, which is at the end of the day what we need to do. And then, of course, quality controls, assessment of data quality, et cetera, which is, I think we've been practicing now for 80 years on financial data. We didn't have that 80 years ago either. This needs to go so much faster, but we can build a lot on what we have in terms of financial data. So what we see is that more and more customers are adding sustainability knowledge to their finance departments, which is a super good first step. So a lot of new roles developing, sustainability data controllers and stuff like that, where you see that something is happening here. But there's a way to go.
Thank you. Excuse me. Alexander, if I can come to you. We're trying to be ahead of the curve, but what's the next frontier? What do you think you need to do next?
Next, in terms of how do we get ahead of the curve, right? I mean, I think the themes that were emerging here also in the panel, I mean, the big headline for me is collaboration. I mean, that is what we need to get. I mean, ahead of the curve maybe has this competition image about I need to, be first or be, elbow mentality, whatever it might be. But I think it's a little bit of that in terms of I want to show that I'm a leader in this space. But it's also a lot about how can we work together on actually making this possible, because we are connected through these value chains, through our finance emissions. So in order to kind of take the next step to be ahead of the curve, it's really like look around you, how can we take everyone on board to really make this work for all of us? And I find it very encouraging. We heard yesterday also from Oxford that actually companies come together and mandate regulators to actually increase the reporting burden, so to speak. Well, maybe not burden, but the scrutiny with which reporting is being followed through in the carbon space. You mentioned the parallel to finance and financial accounting. Quite encouragingly, we see the IFRS taking over more and more responsibilities, actually. They're going to eat up the TCFD that's going to be assembled under the IS SSB. I know a lot of acronyms here, but bear with me. So it is just more and more aligned with how we do financial accounting. And that is good because that is standardized, that is quite rigorous. And companies, when they hear IFRS, they suddenly, oh, I think I really have to pay attention to this one. So again, collaboration, standardization, and making the invisible visible. That's ultimately what we need. We need to account for these nebulous emissions.
If I can come to you, Jonas, a similar sort of question about what's next on your journey as you try and stay ahead of the curve.
In terms of decarbonization, I just talked about our targets, and of course that is a very big priority for us. In terms of data quality and the topic of this panel, I talked about the capabilities we're trying to build. Right now we're running a huge digital program to try to set this up. This is a very, very big investment, and of course not all companies should even try to do it like this, why I think solutions like you're talking about is very needed. But we realize we need to build this internally right now. And therefore, this capability of trying to increase accuracy in every specific part, so we are able to forecast what are the likely emissions of this individual car that are to be put in a market in 2028, 2029. That is very much what we are. So we feel credible that we spend our money wisely, and also that we are able to meet the target that we're rather proudly talking about. Because of course it's a risk, but we need to meet these targets. But in the end of the day, the world also needs us to reduce emissions, so it's all connected.
Yeah. Maria, if you have one sort of message you'd like to give to Normative about what you'd like to see them do more of or help you achieve.
So I think they are specialists in carbon data, and they can see the holistic picture on what's kind of developing. We are a consumer of that data, and I think Normative has a extremely important task to bridge across and seeing that they're doing something over there in that market that works with those companies, and to bring that forward and bring it back to us so that we know these companies will probably report in this kind of fashion, and that will be because they're going there next. So explain to us what the different segments are doing. That could be a super good translator for us in finance.
How does that sound?
I would say we're on it. Like let's work together for sure. Again, I just especially for the financial sector, and people might shut down if they don't associate themselves with the financial sector. But we all are part of this. I mean, you have certain line of financing, etc. So this is like really at the core of it. That's why again we brought the white paper together with also Nordea, CDP, others. Let's work on the next one together, I would say, because there are so many learnings we can share, we can bring out there, and to add value to the entire industry. So again, like I would say, we're entirely aware of this. That's why we see collaborations, especially around policy, bring together businesses and policy leaders to actually enable, facilitate this dialogue, and then keep what we do best. So connecting high quality data, accurate data across the entire value chain, also especially in finance.
We're going to wrap up our session now. It's been a fascinating conversation. Let me start with you, if I can, Jonas. Is there something you wish you could have said that you haven't had the chance to say when it comes to this topic?
I've said so much. I'm not sure I need to say anything more. I think all of us are very dependent on high quality data. I think all solutions are very, very much needed. And even though we are building the capability that I'm just saying right now, of course we should not do it for everything we're doing, but at the same time, I also care about the emissions of the tables and furnitures and everything else we also buy that is not a car. But I don't want to have our experts spend time on doing LCAs on tables, etc. So we need solutions that can help us focus on the most important things, and get the quality of data on other stuff that we should perhaps not do analysis on ourselves. So I think all of us likely need the solution we talk about here.
And a last word to you, Maria, same thing. Anything that you feel that we've missed out on in this conversation?
No, exactly. I think we've said a lot. I don't think we've missed any particular topic. We've been all over the place. But I think we talk a lot about collaboration. We talk a lot about pioneering possible. And I think the next phase is really about unlocking some of these difficulties or challenges or just something to do in different companies and showing that it is possible and not waiting for the perfect, because I think then we might become insecure, and it also time passes by too fast. So we need to make investments and need to bet on something working. For that, we don't need perfect data. Quality of data is good, of course, but distinguish that from what do you really need to make a decision. And it's a lot about showing that you're onto it, you're building capabilities, you're preparing yourself to actually be a carbon smart company. I think that's the key right now.
Let's not let the best be the enemy of the good when trying to make the invisible visible. Thank you very much to this panel. A warm hand to them, please. Exactly.